How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to the TAPED podcast, the most corrupt podcast in the world, where your host is always myself, MickyT.
And me, Nostalgia.
And welcome back to another edition of the Worst Bests, the usual series. And for this one, we're going to be tackling, technically not one band, but more or less two bands. But there's a reason why, because today we are going to be ranking the discographies of Joy Division and New Order.
Woo,
and that is very
yeah.
exciting. And of course, I'm sure everybody knows the deal with Joy Division and New Order. After Ian Curtis passed away, the remaining members of Joy Division formed New Order. And the rest is more or less history. So, you ready?
I'm ready.
Alright, great. So, we have 12 albums here, including Lost Sirens. So, we're going to be starting all the way at the number 12 spot. And in my opinion, the worst Joy Division / New Order album, the worst in the list, is Waiting for the Sirens' Call.
I agree.
I'm sure that even before we got to the other albums, that it's pretty common for older bands to just kind of dip in quality as they go on for one reason or another. And that pretty much happened to New Order past the 80s. And while none of the albums that they've dropped are bad, a lot of them are pretty average or just straight up mediocre. And in my opinion, Waiting for the Sirens' Call is the peak of their unfortunate post-80s mediocrity. You know, every New Order album for me has had at least one major highlight. Even some of the weaker albums have a track or two that's really great to me. But Waiting for the Sirens' Call just flat out has nothing to take away from it. Like, the only track I suppose I disliked was the final song, but everything else is just pleasant but unmemorable. Well, these tracks just don't really have much in the way of anything that's standout or catchy. There isn't really many hooks that I could take away from them, and the production is just so bland. You know, the band were heavy into their alt-rock phase at this point, as well as sticking with some of their electronic elements, and honestly, I can't really say that they have much to show for on here. There just isn't really anything that's great about it. It's just mostly subpar, really. Not to mention, this album just overstays its welcome, and it's bloated as hell. It's got so much filler. It's 56 minutes, and that 56 minutes is never going to be got back. God damn it. Honestly, I have nothing else to say about it, really. There just isn't much to say about it. Aside from that, it's the worst New Order album, and it's a very mediocre album at that. As much as I hate to say it, as much as I like New Order, this isn't good. This ain't it, Chief.
I'm definitely there with you. This album is just so absolutely uninspired and sterile that even discussing it in a negative light is just far from interesting. And, you know, to be perfectly honest, despite some promising ideas near the latter half of the album, that whole thing is just a slow and meandering slog. It just isn't offensive, it's insignificant in pretty much every avenue, and it's probably the least notable album in the band's entire discography, just because it just purely lacks any real significance, neither negative or positive. It just kind of sits there and just begs to be forgotten. The synth work just sounds so thin and weak. Lyrically, it's completely devoid of any standout material. And, you know, the guitar work at times is just about as exciting as plain toast. You know, it also doesn't help that this project is almost an hour long, and ultimately it's just an hour of absolutely insignificant and just almost sleep-inducing material. And yeah, it's probably an album that I won't be lining up to return to anytime soon.
Ditto. And my favorite tracks from Waiting for the Sirens' Call, honestly, none of them. I don't remember a single song from this thing. My least favorite track, though, is Working Overtime. That song, no.
My favorite tracks are Guilt is a Useless Emotion and Turn. My least favorite tracks are Who's Joe and Crafty.
Who's Joe?
Who's Joe?
Yeah, we're going to leave it at that. Anyways.
Oh.
You didn't get it.
I was like, wait, why do you sound so worried? I thought you loved that track or something.
No, never mind. No, I was just trying to do a funny. Didn't pan out.
No, it was funny, but I just thought you were like offended that I would put it as my worst track.
Well, I'm not. I wouldn't remember a thing from that album anyway.
Fair.
Okay, moving on now to our number 11 picks. I chose Lost Sirens.
And again, I agree.
Despite Lost Sirens being this low, it's somewhat of an interesting album to note in New Order's discography, as it was an album that was in the works while Peter Hook was still in the band, and it was around the time Waiting for the Siren's Call had been released that it was made. Well, the album finally saw the light of day in 2013, and honestly, it's not that great, but at least I could say that it was better than Waiting for the Siren's Call. I mean, it isn't bad at all, but I just don't see much that's interesting about it. Like, the songs are fine and they do have to offer more in comparison. They have more to offer in comparison with the album that came before, but it still falls into the bland New Order conventions. As a result, the songs just really don't do much for me. Like, for the most part, it's fine. It's not really doing much wrong. It's listenable, but it's just a really bland sounding album, and it sounds like the band were just kind of lost with the ideas they attempted here, and there's just not really a sense of cohesion. Plus, despite how short it feels like it feels like a bit of a slog. The songs here are just a blur, to be honest. It's a shame that this would be the final like bit of contributions that Hooky would have in the band's discography, but hey, what can you really do? That's just life. I guess that it's nice that there aren't really any bad tracks on here, but God, it's boring, and not a single track stands out to me personally. All in all, it's okay. I don't really care for it, and it doesn't really have much about it that's great, if I'm being real here. Why are you talking over me?
Because I just heard silence for a bit. I think Discord trolled me.
Discord being a sneaky little trolls. Naughty, naughty Discord.
Naughty, naughty. But yeah, anyways, I mean, same album, and again, I share a lot of your sentiments. It's weird that an album that kind of is, crafted entirely from, scraps, not really scraps, but an album that was kind of put on the back burner in favor of, what was the previous, Waiting for the Siren's Call, is somehow better than that album, the album that they did actually end up releasing at the time. But that being said, marginally so. It's just the album is just so mediocre that its whole existence is just truly baffling to me. The album was just, again, on the back burner for so long that you'd think there's at least something noteworthy about it, that they finally decided to release it after all these years and wrap this chapter up. But ultimately, it just kind of falls in the same category as its predecessor. It just isn't that interesting. It's just a little sterile. The instrumentation here is just a little weak. And, the only things that are really notable on this album is that it is the last album with Peter Hook as part of the band. And also, I guess it was kind of released to maybe, build up some hype for the band's upcoming project, Music Complete. But other than that, I just... I don't think it's a bad album, but ultimately... after a 12-year wait, it definitely is a little bit of a disappointing album, and I can't imagine being very excited. I mean, very hot on this album after having to wait that many years. Obviously, I wasn't.
Was it 12 years really?
No, it wasn't 12. I think it was 8 years. But obviously, I wasn't a Joy Division fan at the time. I was a little too young, but I mean, a New Order fan, but I don't think this was worth the wait in any capacity.
Yeah. Excuse me. My favorite track from Lost Sirens is Hellbent. Worst track is I've Got a Feeling.
My favorite track is I'll Stay With You. My least favorite track is Shake It Up.
Alright, we're moving on to our number 10 pick, and I chose Republic.
I chose Get Ready.
Alright. So yeah, Republic. What an absolutely hideous album cover. How in the fuck was that cover made by the same man who made covers like Unknown Pleasures? Just how? That is baffling. Jesus Christ. Anyways, Republic is not a very good album in my opinion. It's really the first dud in the band's discography, and it was an album that pretty much saw where their discography just kind of tanked in quality. It all just happened in such a whim as well. I mean, the album doesn't start off too bad with the track Regret, which is actually really great and is the main highlight of the album. But after that, it just devolves into one of the most uninteresting albums that New Order have ever made. I'm not really sure what happened, but it's clearly affected the band on this album since they just seem so disinterested. Like, it's not a bad album by any means, but it's just so nondescript and bland. I mean, throughout the album, there's hints of the New Order we recognize, but there just isn't really much to it that holds it up on par with some of the band's best works, and there's just very little that's really attention grabbing or interesting about it. Republic, yeah, it's just bland. The production feels too clean, and a lot of Republic just seems like it falls into this trap of like bland 90s electronic pastiche. The songs just blend together, and it just absolutely does nothing for me as a whole. There's some production ideas and hooks that come off really awkward, and there just isn't really much to any of the performances on here as well. It just feels so weak. Aside from that, there just isn't really much else to say about it, except that was the obvious point where New Order sort of fell off and where they failed to make many interesting records thereafter. So, it peaks at the beginning and then it just takes a fat nosedive.
I went with Get Ready, the band's kind of comeback album after a better part of a decade. I think 8-year break again. Which, interesting enough, it's been 8 years since their last album, so maybe they're due on this here. But I digress. And rather than, a return to the chapter they left off on, it really does mark a pretty significant shift in the band's sound into something a lot more guitar-oriented than synth-oriented at times. It certainly makes for some solid moments, and it does stand out in the New Order discography, at least because of, the kind of stylistic change. But as a whole, it's just not really that much of a welcome change in my eyes. The album does just really sound like a lot of early 2000s rock radio pastiche. Rarely does the band, attempt anything that countless other artists weren't doing at the time, and it also just doesn't even impress, like, instrumentally, songwriting wise. It just kind of feels like a just middle of the park, just serviceable rock album. Nothing special. If it was any other band, really, if it was a band that released this as their debut per se, I don't think anyone would ever be talking about it. I know this album does have some fans, and I can kind of understand that, but for me, it just kind of wears its influences on its sleeve a little too much, and just doesn't really have anything that is special in any way, just listenable.
Yeah. My favorite tracks from Republic are Regret and Ruined in a Day. Worst track is Times Change.
My favorite tracks on what's the album called? Get Ready are Turn My Way and Primitive Notion. My least favorite tracks are Slow Jam and Rock the Shack.
Oh god, Rock the Shack is awful. Jesus Christ. Okay, we're moving on to our number 9 picks, and I chose Get Ready.
And I chose Republic.
Haha, the switcheroo. So yeah, Get Ready, the band's comeback record that came out in 2001, and it's an album that saw the band drastically change their sound for better or for worse. New Order seem like they're kind of adapting to the landscape that surrounds them in a new decade, and while it doesn't always pan out well, I do have to admit, I do like some bits of Get Ready, even if I do have some big critiques for it. I suppose to start with the positives, there are a few tracks that I do think are really good, and they're ones that I really enjoy. Crystal is great, Turn My Way is really good. I appreciate everyone's favourite bald fraud Billy Corgan being there as well. That was pretty cool. I really love Vicious Streak. Primitive Notion is cool. And the last track is a really nice closer. I think it sounds pretty good. The production is really good all around. And for the most part, the band sound comfortable in this predominantly alt-rock setting. But of course, Get Ready is pretty flawed. The remaining cuts in the album just seem pretty uninspired and not that memorable. They seem pretty bland to me as well, and there's one track on here that is just downright bad, and that is Rock the Shack. I fucking hate that song so much. It's probably New Order's worst song, if I'm being real here.
Oh.
If I'm being real here. And, could be. And, yeah, and like you said, Get Ready is, I suppose it definitely takes a lot of influence from kind of radio alt-rock that was coming out at the time, and it definitely wears it kind of boldly on its sleeve, and it kind of gets to a point where it's just like, okay, wow, this is really just New Order doing alt-rock. Okay, this is fine. It's not that interesting.
Mm-hmm.
For sure, it's a bit of a mixed bag of an album, but I did really like a few tracks from it. Would I go back to this album over numerous other New Order albums? No, absolutely not. But for what it's worth, it's not the worst thing ever. Rock the Shack definitely is, though. I will shit on that song every chance I get.
Yeah, I went with Republic, the band's, I think, 1983 project, and I really cannot tell which part of the album is the most uninspired part. Is it the music or is it the album cover? I have to reiterate how disgusting that album cover is.
How the fuck did the same guy make Unknown Pleasures? What the fuck?
Yeah, fuck knows. Anyways, if you're not already familiar, the conditions that this album was made in were less than ideal, to say the the least. The band were at this point anything but obligated. The band at this point were obligated pretty much to make this project. I can't remember exactly, some contract reasons and just promoting a tour, something not important.
Something label bullshit.
Yeah. But it's clear that nobody here really gave a shit about the project or even about New Order anymore. Bernard and Peter were at each other's throats. New Order had become, somewhat of an afterthought for everyone involved. And luckily enough, I think the band were just too talented and on too much of a hot streak to completely fuck things up. The project clearly is uninspired and clearly just fails in comparison to the band's previous however many 5 projects, but it's at the same time it does have some catchy moments. It still displays a New Order that had been on as I said, an incredible hot streak of albums, and at this point it was probably the worst thing they could have made, but ultimately I don't think that the album lives up to any of the the band's 80s material. It even is outshone by an album from their post-hiatus era, in my opinion. And yeah, it is a chore to get through, especially given the clear lack of enthusiasm and even want to make music from the band. But at the same time, given those circumstances, it could have been a lot worse.
With that in mind, yeah, it definitely could have been a lot worse. Holy shit. Okay, my favourite tracks from Get Ready are Crystal, Turn My Way, and Vicious Streak. Worst track is Rock the Shack.
My favourite tracks on Republic are Regret, Chemical, and Avalanche. My least favourite track is Times Change.
Alright, we're moving on to our number 8 picks, and I chose Music Complete.
I chose Movement.
Alright. Music Complete, as of right now, is the most recent New Order album, and it's, in my opinion, the band's best post-hiatus album. I think it's also important to note that this is also the only album that bassist Peter Hook isn't on. He left the band in 2007, and to be honest, it's looking like he's not going to come back. Gillian Gilbert came back after her hiatus from the band, so that's a dub. With that in mind, it would have been intriguing to hear what a New Order album without Hooky would sound like, and it sounds pretty solid in retrospect. This album is actually pretty decent. It has its issues, of course. For one, I think that it has an issue with overstaying its welcome, as the album itself is just a bit too long, in my opinion, and some of the tracks here are just kind of meandering and just overstay their welcome as well. There are a few tracks I don't care for, but aside from that, there's a lot to admire about Music Complete. For one, there's a lot of really great tracks in this thing that are some of the best New Order have made in years. Secondly, the band are back with their predominantly synthesizer-based sound that makes their best material so good, but with influences that culminate from electropop and classic house. And finally, it just seems like Music Complete had a direction and a feel that it was going for, which a lot of the albums that preceded it just didn't have, and or they just seemed like disinterested, whereas on Music Complete, they seem interested, they have the passion, and it's clearly showing with a lot of the great tracks on here. The performances and the production is really good, it's very layered, and the beats all over this thing are tasteful and catchy a lot of the time. I wouldn't go and listen to this over a few other New Order records, but it isn't without its good aspects, which are always appreciated. Music Complete, it's a bit flawed in my opinion, but it's one of their better later albums, and it's definitely a much needed boost after a lot of their pretty mediocre albums.
I went with New Order's debut, Movement. This is quite the fascinating project, regardless of me not rating it as high as a lot of the band's other projects. I still think it holds a special place in the band's discography. It, as I said, was the first ever New Order project, and it was recorded in the wake of Ian Curtis's suicide. And the impact of that event is kind of inescapable throughout this album, and honestly makes for a pretty haunting listening experience. It's almost uncanny just how much this project sounds like Joy Division, but minus Ian Curtis. I think the band here were very clearly at a crossroads. They were kind of lost without any real sense of direction, and so they did what they knew what to do, and they hung out onto that Joy Division sound, and tried to replicate it to the best of their ability. And obviously, you can't go wrong instrumentally, even aside from Ian Curtis's incredible impact and performances. Joy Division were a great band instrumentally, and a lot of that bleeds into this project. And that being said, you can definitely kind of hear some semblance of a synth pop sound develop at moments on this project, but largely it is a very kind of post-punky, almost gothic rocky release. It's a tough project to listen to, in my opinion. It is for me one of the most depressing albums of all time, not really because of the music itself, but because of the everything surrounding it. And it really does kind of mark a bridge between New Order and Joy Division, and I think that without Ian, I think the band were better off kind of expanding their sound and trekking new horizons, but at this point in time they hadn't really figured that part out yet. So yeah, it's just, I guess, New Order post Ian Curtis's suicide trying to find themselves.
Yeah, my favourite tracks from Music Complete are Singularity, Plastic, and People on the High Line. Worst track is Nothing But a Fool.
My favourite tracks on Movement are Dreams Never End. Holy fuck, that track is incredible. Chosen Time and The Hymn. And my least favourite track is Truth.
Alright, we're going to conclude the first half of our lists with the number 7 pick. And I chose Movement.
I chose Music Complete.
Fucking hell.
Same exact bottom half.
Same exact bottom half, but just switched around. Okay. So, Movement. New Order's debut. So, this was where the new chapter of a band would begin. New Order was born after the untimely death of Ian Curtis, and the remaining members decided to keep going, with Bernard Sumner taking up vocal duties and Gillian Gilbert joining on synthesizer duties. Fuck. Given the sound we're normally accustomed to with New Order, it would be pretty interesting to see what they would have done in their debut as a regrouped band, and for the most part, Movement is a unique album from New Order. But for me at least, I appreciate Movement more for its place in the New Order discography rather than as a full-blown album. I definitely agree with what you say. Movement is just really fucking depressing. It's one of the most depressing albums in context. Movement is... I suppose I see it as more of a transitional album, if anything, since the band are very much holding on to the Joy Division post-punk sound. It's very bleak and dark and gothic in tone, much like Joy Division. Hell, even Bernard is sticking to a delivery that feels akin to the way that Ian Curtis sang. It feels like the bridge that they would have had to get from Closer to Power, Corruption and Lies, since it does sound a lot like Closer in my opinion, but you can kind of hear the tones and the sounds that would be more present on their more definitive material, like kind of crop up. Even with that out of mind, I do think that there's some great tracks in this album. Instrumentally, it's still great. The opener, Dreams Never End, is amazing. It's one of my favourite New Order songs, and there's a couple of pretty good songs in this album too. The production is really good, even if Bernard sounds a little buried. I like how much more prominent the synths are becoming. I know there were synths on Joy Division's work, but not to the extent that they were on Movement. As it goes on, though, I do feel like the album gets a bit... I do feel lost with the album, personally, since as it goes on, it just feels a bit tedious at points. It has some material that just isn't all that interesting to me. It just feels like the band were clearly going through a lot at the time. I mean, this came out a year after after Ian's suicide. Am I correct in that?
Yeah, a year.
Yeah, so they're still dealing with a fucking lot on this album, and it's clear that they are. And that kind of bleeds into the music in a way as well, I'd say. But the tedious tracks, they don't do much for me. But hey, what's good about this album is good, and I do really appreciate what New Order did on this. But obviously, New Order would only build upon their sound and just be getting more synth poppy as they go on. And for me, at least, that feels right for New Order, in my opinion. I mean, I still appreciate Movement, and it has its great tracks, but yeah, Movement is number 7 for me.
I went with the band's most recent album, Music Complete, and this is the point in my rankings where I'm pretty sure everything here is an 8+. So this is the good shit. So Music Complete is an album that I very much adore, and despite falling slightly short of the band's finest records, I think Music Complete is still a great project, and it's by far the most interesting and well crafted album in the band's late career. A return to form, if you will. That being said, it is the band's first project without Peter Hook. Obviously a very iconic and important staple of the band's music up to that point. However, I think that the band pretty much do the best they could have possibly done without his presence, and still make for an album that is, while not a standout among the best New Order projects, definitely still a very, very strong addition to their discography. The band puts their alt rock pastiche era behind them, as on this project they again embrace the synths more so than they have in years, and they go back to a very alternative dance / synth pop sound that we all know and love them for. And while yes, it does kind of feel like the band is just playing within their comfort zone, I think the execution here is just fantastic, and it really makes for a very enjoyable listen. And despite the loss of Hook's iconic bass lines, I really think that the band really zeroed in on the synth work and made it just more anthemic, more powerful, just more in your face than it had been in years. And I really think that kind of distracted the listener from the lack of a Peter Hook, which was such an ever-present force on New Order's project. And ultimately, I mean, obviously I love Peter Hook, but I don't think the band is completely lost here without him. That being said, the melodies are also very, very strong and memorable. The synth work again is just at times out of this world, to be honest. And the house influence as well really just kind of send things home and mark this as kind of a more modern era New Order album. But yeah, I think it's a fantastic album. It's got some absolute standout tracks, like Singularity or Plastic. Plenty of tracks that just get things right in every aspect, whether it be the guitar work, the drumming, and the synth work. It just is a very fun, very enjoyable album, and it just kind of feels like New Order playing to their strengths. With in 2015, I think it's the best thing to do.
Okay. My favourite tracks from Movement are Dreams Never End and Chosen Time. Worst track, Doubts Even Here.
My favourite tracks on Music Complete are Singularity, Plastic, and Unlearn This Hatred. My least favourite track is Stray Dog.
Okay, we're in the top half of our list now. Number 6. And this is where all the albums are good for me. So everything here is good onward. And my number 6 pick is Brotherhood.
My number 6 pick is Low Life.
Ooh, wow. I thought that would have been a bit higher for you, damn.
Well, we'll see.
Okay. When I was first checking out Brotherhood for this worst to best, I honestly was pretty indifferent towards it on first listen. I don't know what it was about it, but it just didn't do a whole lot for me, and there are a few tracks where Bernard Sumner's vocals just flat out annoyed me. But honestly, with more listens, it's grown on me a lot, and while I don't think that it's one of New Order's best, I still really like a lot of things about it. Brotherhood isn't very dissimilar from, say, Low Life or Power, Corruption, Lies. It's very much the synth pop and new wave that you expect from New Order, but with different vocal inflections and the same old formula. The production is just as good as you'd expect an 80s New Order album to sound, the performances are really good, and of course there's some really fantastic tracks to behold on here, like As It Is, When It Was, Broken Promise, All Day Long, and of course Bizarre Love Triangle, which is one of the best New Order songs ever made. But there's just something about this album that kinda holds it back from me. To me, it just seems like New Order haven't really been adding anything new to their sound, and for me at least, records like Power, Corruption, Lies and Low Life are as good as they are. I don't really see myself returning to Brotherhood over those two, since those records are just as good as they are. Okay, so that doesn't take away from its qualities at all. No chance. But that's just how I'm feeling, since a lot of the tracks just kind of fall into that pastiche in this album. Haven't got too much else to say besides that. I like the album, I think that it's good, and I'm glad it's grown on me. But New Order have made way better albums, in my opinion.
Um, yeah, I went with Low Life. And this is the project where, for me, the band just kind of jumped fully into the metaphorical pool of synth pop. The rock and post-punk roots at this point just completely start to fade well into the background, and the New Order we get on this project just kind of fully encapsulates the iconic 80s sound that most people know and remember them for. The synth work on the band's previous album, Power, Corruption and Lies, always kind of seemed like sort of an ornament to the music, but on Low Life it kind of is the foundation, and it's honestly everything. The synth lines here are very spacious, they're invigorating and just absolutely dreamy. The melodies are always memorable. The songwriting is just very, very sweet. And you know, ultimately it's a fantastic record, and it's got everything you'd kind of want in a New Order project. But I just think that they have better, more solid, and for me personally, more memorable albums. It's definitely not a dig at this album's quality, because again, it's a very good album. It is an 8 out of 10 for me. And it just, for me, is not the finest example of a New Order synth pop sound, and it just kind of suffers because I do think other albums are just better, and that's that.
I can apply that to Brotherhood. Anyways, my favourite tracks from Brotherhood are As It Is When It Was, Broken Promise, and Bizarre Love Triangle. My least favourite track is Angel Dust.
My favourite tracks are Love, Vigilantes, The Perfect Kiss, and Face Up. My least favourite track is Subculture.
Alright, moving on to our number 5 picks, I chose Technique.
I chose Brotherhood.
Alright. Technique is the last stop in the very consistent run of albums that New Order came out with in the 80s, and I'm not really sure what else I could say about it, except that it's a really good album that has some of the more unique and interesting solid palettes of New Order's records. Technique contains a lot of what makes New Order who they are. There's plenty of synth pop and new wave, but this time the band kind of delve into one of their most expansive sounding eras ever, with much more psychedelic yet glossy textures. There's more synthetic and beat driven songs that are leaning a lot into the influences of acid house, and the guitar tones are getting into more jangly territories as well, which make for some really great moments. New Order were very important for house music generally and the development of it, but this album is where those influences are at their most blatant, and for me at least, the band deliver on some really sick tracks and outside of those types of tracks, they deliver on some really solid moments too. I really like some of these moments. Generally, I like the album as a whole, and I definitely return to it for another listen, but I wouldn't call this as great as some of their other records. It's very good, don't get me wrong, but there's a few tracks here that just don't really strike me as much all that interesting. It's kind of similar to my critiques of Brotherhood, but thankfully those moments are only really a rare occurrence on Technique, and with the newer territories they dove into, it adds a bit of interest this album peaks for me, and just generally the ideas and the execution of these ideas is just really great in my opinion. So yeah, production is great, plenty of great tracks. There's a reason why they use that goat sample on Fine Time, just saying. And while this album isn't perfect, it's still really damn good, and I'd put it in the higher tier of New Order's discography because of that.
Yeah, my number 5 pick is Brotherhood. And on this album, what you get is kind of the better aspects of, you know, an album like Low Life, and overall just kind of make things that little bit more catchy, little bit more infectious, and little bit more sweet, and that's you get Brotherhood. And those 3 reasons are basically the why this album is slightly higher than Low Life, because ultimately I think these albums are very comparable. They do kind of see the band exploring a very similar style. And, you know, a lot of the praises that I gave Low Life, I can also throw at Brotherhood, and vice versa. Initially, when I was doing these rankings, this album wasn't that high, to be honest, but it slowly kind of climbed up and up my rankings. And ultimately, I think it's just one of the catchiest albums in their discography. A lot of the melodies, a lot of the moments on here just really, really stuck with me. Weirdo, All Day Long, Every Little Counts, and, you know, of course, Bizarre Love Triangle are all just such feel good and pleasant tracks, and they all definitely live up to New Order's very high standards. And as a whole, I also have to say that this project is one of the most consistent albums of the 80s. There is really not a single low point for me. Every single track on here just kind of ranges from a strong 7 to a strong 8 for me. It never really dips below that in quality, and it really kind of is a very fun listening experience throughout. Because of that, it never once dips in terms of entertainment. At the same time, the only thing really preventing me from rating this album any higher is that the peaks on here also aren't quite as high as a lot of the band's other projects. There's no real tracks on here that I would rate over a 9. And, a lot of the projects that I've ranked above here just really do have those, wow factors in those tracks. But at the same time, it's still a fantastic album. It's one that I obviously sometimes gets overlooked aside from, obviously, the lead single. And I think that's probably because it's sandwiched between two very iconic and beloved albums. But nonetheless, I still think it's a fantastic moment in the band's discography, and definitely one of their most catchy and infectious.
Alright, my favourite tracks from Technique are Fine Time, All the Way, and Mr. Disco. My least favourite track is Loveless.
My favourite tracks on Brotherhood are Weirdo, Broken Promise, and All Day Long. My least favourite track... I don't have a least favourite track, I said that.
Alright, moving on to our number 4 picks. And I chose Power, Corruption, and Lies.
And I agree.
Oh shit, I thought you'd have way higher. Fuck. Okay. Power, Corruption, and Lies. No. Okay, never mind. Anyways, straight face. Anyways, Power, Corruption, and Lies is the album where New Order more or less became New Order. Obviously, singles like the iconic Blue Monday also have a say in that, but when it comes to an album format, Power, Corruption, and Lies is the one, and it's easy to see why this album is as beloved and as highly regarded as it is, since as a whole, it's just a really great synthpop album. The band are no longer holding on to the sound that previously defined them. They're somewhat post-punky in a sense. Some moments are a bit post-punk influenced still, but they developed on what they were looking to do on Movement and opted to make something that had much more of a pop appeal, much more of a synth-heavy and electronic appeal, something that's much more brighter and much more expressive. And you can hear that all over this album with the synth tones, the melodies, and Bernard Sumner's vocals. The album as a whole sounds like so 80s, but it's aged so well given the way that this album is produced and how tasteful it sounds. I adore the way this album sounds. I will even go as far as to say that this album has some of the greatest synth tones on any album ever. They just sound that amazing, and the sound of this thing works so well with the way that Bernard Sumner sings. In contrast with Movement, Bernard sounds way more expressive on Power, Corruption, Lies. I love the way he sounds in this album, and that more bright delivery makes for some fantastic songs. Not to mention, the songwriting is just great as well. Of course, the album's main centerpiece is the opener, the absolutely incredible Age of Consent, which, honestly, one of the greatest synth-pop tracks of all time, if not the greatest, and it's a perfect song. I adore everything about it. Personally, though, I do think that the album kind of peaks at that song, but that doesn't take away from the tracks thereafter, because there's a lot of fantastic ones on this album alongside it, like The Village, 568, which is somewhat house-esque in my opinion, and Leave Me Alone, just to name a few. There are a few tracks that aren't that interesting to me, but those moments are very few and far in between, since what's great on this album is truly great, and that in turn just makes for a great album. There may be a few minor critiques about the repetitiveness or kind of the way that it paces itself. I will complain no further after that, because there's some fantastic material on here, and as a whole, I just think it's one of the best albums New Order have ever made, and it's definitely up there as one of the best classic synth-pop albums ever made. But there's just one particular New Order album that I prefer.
Again, definitely agree with a lot of what you said. Power, Corruption, and Lies really is the project that sees the band finally finding themselves and, kind of the synth-pop sound that they, would grow to be known for. Despite being the band's first full foray into that synth-pop sound, I still think it's one of the finest albums in the entire genre. Unlike a lot of their later albums, this project still has a very heavy post-punk core, However, it definitely still sounds a lot more gentle and playful than a lot of Joy Division's material, and that distinction is something that New Order would definitely kind of build upon. Um, but again, with the aforementioned synth-pop sound, I really think that it's not quite as developed as it would go on to be on this sound. It definitely does at times feel like kind of an amalgamation of synth-pop and post-punk, which I absolutely adore and I absolutely have no problem with, as both are genres that are very, very near and dear to my heart. But I do think that there is one particular project where the band kind of just expanded that synth aspect of their sound to just such high horizons that it's really hard to compare. That being said, this project is still absolutely incredible. It's got just so many absolutely standout moments, and it really is kind of a parting of the clouds in the band's discography, as they were kind of finally able to move past the tragedy and come back with their own unique sound. The result is at best just absolutely perfect. Obviously, Age of Consent is far and away the best New Order song in my opinion, and it's literally so genius and so perfect that I fail to understand how human beings were able to make this track. But it also has some absolutely incredible highlights as well, like The Village, like Your Silent Face, and throughout it just is a very, very strong project. I will say, I think maybe the main thing that kind of brings it down below the album I'm going to rank next is the fact that I don't really care for Ultraviolence. It does kind of slow down the pace of the album, and the track Ecstasy is also just decent at best. However, pretty much everything aside from those two tracks is just incredible, and throughout it's a fantastic project. It definitely feels like the project feels like the band finding themselves, and ultimately it's a very important and iconic step in their discography. I just prefer one album.
Yeah, and with that in mind, my favourite tracks from Power, Corruption and Lies are Age of Consent, The Village, and 586. My least favourite track is Ultraviolence. I 100% agree with you on that track.
Mm-hmm. My favourite tracks are Age of Consent, The Village, and Your Silent Face, and my least favourite track is Ultraviolence.
Okay, we're moving on to the top 3 in our list now. And in my opinion, the number 3 pick for me is Low Life.
My number 3 pick is Technique.
Damba.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, Low Life. High key, this is my favourite New Order album. I know all the biggest accolades get handed over to Power, Corruption, Lies, but honestly, the more that I've thought about it and the more that I've re-listened to both of them, the more that I realised how much I preferred Low Life. It's New Order doing what New Order does best, but for me at least, it's done in a way that's just much more punchy, much more catchy, and just much more concise. It's pretty much the moment where New Order broke away from their post-punk roots and instead just flat out just got rid of that sound and became their own. It's a fantastic synth-pop record, which wasn't uncommon for New Order in the 80s, and for me, I think that it's New Order's most consistent album, their most memorable album, their most catchy album, and one of their tightest records ever. It's got everything you expect in a New Order album, but what elevates it further for me is just the amount of just consistently fantastic head-nodding tracks that are on this album, and just how many of them are up there as some of my favourite New Order songs, like Love Vigilante, The Perfect Kiss, Sunrise, which is honestly one of the most underrated New Order songs, Subculture, and just the otherworldly Elegia. Not to mention, the production is fantastic all around, as expected, and I think that the band really masterfully execute a sound that feels much more direct and punchy, which really adds to the catchiness of the album for me. Bernard Sumner's vocals are great on this album, the synths sound great, the guitar work is great, the drumming is great, and the bass work from Hooky is fantastic as per. There isn't a bit of instrumentation that feels weak to me, it's just all performed with such... It's just great, and there's barely a weak moment. Also, just as an album, it flows immaculately. I think it flows the best out of any New Order album, and it just goes by so seamlessly and doesn't drag on at all, in my opinion. That was an issue that I had with Power, Corruption, Lies, personally. I just feel like None of that is happening on Low Life at all, and I just thoroughly enjoyed every minute of it, and I get the most out of it when compared to every New Order album. It's that doesn't take away from the others though. There's a lot of really good New Order albums. Yeah, all in all, it's really fun, carefree, it's very catchy, and with what I mentioned, this is what makes this album fantastic to me, and in short, it's my favorite New Order album. But yeah, obviously, it's not number one on my list. We were going to talk about the next two.
Yeah, I'm also kind of revealing my favorite New Order album at this point, and it's Technique. Sometimes you just have to listen to your heart, and no matter how weird or not ranking Power, Corruption and Lies as my favorite New Order album felt, I think Technique is just the album that speaks to me the most. It's the one that, always I was the most excited to whenever I was returning to it when I was preparing for this Worst to Best. And to me, it just manages to ever so slightly shine above the rest in the band's discography. It's just an absolute feel-good and exhilarating alternative dance. I can only describe this album as just the soundtrack to the best fucking party ever. It takes the electronic aspects of the band's previous projects to a whole unique and new level, blending them to, with the sounds of acid house and, a plethora of other electronic influences to create something that I can only describe as magic and something that is really unique in the band's discography. The music on Technique is just so tight. It's so electric. It's so damn infectious. The melodies, I think, were scientifically created in the lab to just be the most earwormy things imaginable. The songwriting, I think, is honestly on par with the band's best, despite, the whole energy of the album being really what, shines the most. And as far as 80s synth pop goes, I think this is about as good as it gets. I do think that Power, Corruption and Lies does have some of the biggest highlights in the band's career. But throughout the course of the album's entire duration, I think this project for me beats it out. It's just a little bit more consistent, and there's just not a single dull moment to be found here. It's just an amazing, incredible pop album from start to finish.
Hells yeah. And with that in mind, my favorite tracks from Low Life are Sunrise, Elysia, and Subculture. If I had to pick a least favorite, I would say Sooner Than You Think.
My favorite tracks on Technique are All the Way, Loveless, and Run. I do not have a least favorite. Nuh-uh.
Alright, moving on to the top two now. And if it isn't obvious enough already, we're Joy Division fanboys. So, yeah. With that in mind, my number 2 pick is Unknown Pleasures.
My number 2 pick is Closer.
The duality of man. Well, shit. The album where it all began. It also happens to be one of the most iconic albums of all time, and that, of course, is Joy Division's debut album, Unknown Pleasures. An album that is beloved by many, and it's what people see as the definitive post-punk album. Unknown Pleasures was one of the first post-punk albums that I ever heard, and to this day, I still love it. It's an album that, like I said, defines post-punk, and it did feel weird listening to this album for the first time, given how, dreary and depressing it was, but obviously, as time grew and the more I listened to it, the more I just kind of understood it, and the more I just felt really attached to it. When I say this album is dark, I well and truly mean it. It has this aura of hopelessness around it, and it's conveyed through the music and through the songwriting from Ian Curtis. It's void of a lot of hope. After the album opener, Disorder, which is a relatively upbeat yet dark track, it descends into this abyss of bleak soundscapes and hopelessness in the post-punk setting, with an atmosphere that just embodies what it means to sound bleak, and with the gothic influences, it makes for just this dissonant and anxious album. The instrumentals on this album are just a cacophony of the stripped back punk nature of the simple setup of guitar, bass and drums, and it's all packaged in this very atmospheric and spacey palette with a few synthesizers that allow the band to create some very spacious and incredibly dark tones. I adore the instrumentals on Unknown Pleasures, not just because of the way they sound, but also because of the playing, since there's just so many great drum beats, guitar licks and bass parts. Some of the best bass work on any album is on here. It's just phenomenal. Some of Hookie's best bass lines are incredible. On this thing, they just transcend like best. Really, they're just out of this world. Like his work is just so simple yet so effective, and we get some fantastic ones like on Disorder and She's Lost Control. I actually learned when I was getting into bass work, I learned some Peter Hook's bass lines, and they're really like go-tos if you want to start playing them. The guitar work is fantastic from Ian Bernard, and Stephen Morris's tight drumming is fantastic. I also just really love the production on this thing. I love the dark simplicity of it. I love the atmospheric and spacey elements too. Plus, with some of the sound effects that are laced into the songs, it has this interesting feel to it, and that feels fairly unique to this album. Plus, at times there were just very few bands that sounded this dark and as gothic, like at the time. That's not everything, of course, but when it's done so damn well like it is on here, that's a huge bonus. Admittedly, like I will say, the one thing I will say about it, obviously it kind of blends together in some kind of way. I totally understand that many people not dig this album because of that, but for me at least, I love this project, and it has some of the greatest post-punk material ever made on it. It's a stellar piece of music that is heralded as one of the greatest albums of all time for a reason. It's just that good, and while I certainly gravitate more towards the number one spot, there's no denying that Unknown Pleasures is an important album, and a fantastic one at that. There's just so many amazing tracks on this thing, and just everything about it is insane.
I went with the Joy Division sophomore and ultimate album, Closer. God, where do I begin? This is one of the most challenging albums of all time. Not because it's, unforgivably experimental or anything, but because it's unforgivably dark. In fact, I think I would go on record to say that it is probably one of, if not the darkest album in music history. There's actually maybe not the.
I would agree though, still.
Yeah, but it's definitely up there. Again, to anyone unfamiliar with the story of Joy Division and Ian Curtis, which I'm assuming, let's be honest, everyone listening to this at this point is
aware of.
This project was released after Ian Curtis's suicide. However, it was recorded it was recorded before his death and released, I want to say, just like 2 or so months after.
Yeah, it was 2 months.
Yeah, it's really just a really dark and depressing album. There's just so many moments of just despair and hopelessness throughout this project. Yet what really strikes me is at the same time there are some very brief moments of kind of bliss and optimism, whether it be the ethereal synth lines on Isolation or the spiraling and playful drum work on Atrocity Exhibition. To someone who isn't familiar with the story of this album, this album isn't all dark. There are some brief moments of kind of hope, and what really kind of seals the deal in terms of how depressing this album is for me is just how, in retrospect, it kind of feels like all of these moments were just a mask of sorts, were just kind of there to maybe portray some kind of sense of hope and normality in Ian Curtis's life. But given what conspired not long after this album was recorded, it ultimately is kind of clear that Ian was in a very, very dark place when he was writing this album, and I think a lot of that hope, a lot of that optimism is very much synthetic, and it just kind of gets hidden beneath all of just the fucking grueling, dark and despondent themes and just instrumentation and atmospheres throughout this project. It feels like it's perhaps one of the most famous posthumous albums of all time, and I think that is in no small part to the fact that the music on this album is just so inseparable from what happened in 1980, and I think that no other album really kind of portrayed the psyche of someone who was in that dark place better than Closer does with Ian Curtis. I don't really know what else to say. I think this is an incredible album. It's sonically so diverse. Instrumentally, it's just very unique and ominous. It's also, I will say, it's also quite groundbreaking in a lot of ways, and you can genuinely trace back the synth sound that New Order would, become so well known for to this album in a kind of roundabout way. And yeah, it's a very groundbreaking project, very important project that has gone on to inspire countless artists, whether it be Danny Brown or Interpol. This project's influences kind of transcends time. But, no matter how much good this project did, I think it's always going to be tied to one of the darkest events in music history. And yeah, that's why it's such a challenging listen. It's an incredible album with a very, very, very dark backstory. And it's dark.
Yeah, fuck. Favorite tracks from Unknown Pleasures, Disorder, She's Lost Control, and Shadowplay. Least favorite track is Wilderness.
My favorite tracks on Closer are Atrocity Exhibition, Heart and Soul, and Decades.
Alright, we're moving on to number 1 picks, and mine is Closer.
And mine is Unknown Pleasures.
Shit. All good things obviously all good things must come to an end eventually, and unfortunately the end of Joy Division would come in the form of their second and final album, Closer. Of course, the band would still live on in the form of New Order, but Joy Division and what the band once were was more or less gone by the time this album came out. As much as I love Unknown Pleasures, I just couldn't think of a number one. I just couldn't think of a number one spot on this particular list without it being Closer, which is my favorite Joy Division album. Obviously, this album is quite infamous outside of the context of the music, and truthfully, it's hard to even avoid bringing this up when talking about it. But yeah, as we mentioned already, obviously this album came out 2 months after Ian Curtis's suicide. He recorded all of his parts before his suicide, and he was set to go on an American tour with the band, but in May of 1980 he did commit suicide. His struggle with depression and epilepsy is well documented. It was something that had already heavily affected his lyricism beforehand, but when it comes to Closer, it just comes off all the more painful and full of anguish. There's just no sugarcoating it. This album is fucking heartbreaking and soul-destroying from a lyrical standpoint and a sonic standpoint. So much so that I even agree, it can be just such a hard album to listen to, and trust me, at points I still find it really hard to stomach after consecutive listens. His self-destructive ramblings add a huge, this emotional weight to the music, and of course, knowing the context of Ian's death, they're all the more just crushing. Unknown Pleasures may have had glimmers of hope, but for me at least, Closer just doesn't really have any. It's just completely hopeless and just despondent. Plus, the dark and cold atmosphere that the production provides is just a all too fitting backdrop for what's going on. Instrumentally and production wise, Closer in many ways doesn't exactly differ from the sounds and the template that Unknown Pleasures put in place, but as far as I'm concerned, I feel like the band kind of perfected what they were trying to do on Closer, and in turn kind of made something that was really unique. The band were very much still within their boundaries of post-punk and gothic rock, but they just kind of put the gothic part to up to 10 because of how just dark everything sounds. The instrumentation is just really murky, and the atmospheres that are presented just sound fantastic as I would like them to be. But the main difference is just how the band build upon their atmospheres. More cold wave synthesizers are brought into the mix here, giving the sound palette a very cold touch, and they blend it with the murkiness of the instrumentation and the gothic atmospheres. So much so that they can come off just kind of hypnotic and intoxicating and kind of entrancing. And of course, that kind of synth sound would also be kind of carried over into New Order's work thereafter. Obviously, the driving bass lines and the grooves from Peter Hook are just as stellar as ever. Bernard Sumner and Ian Curtis's layered and angular guitar work is nothing short of fantastic, and at times the riff kind of melts so well with the grooves and the atmosphere into the atmosphere, and that just puts me in a trance. And Stephen Morris's drummers, Sequenced and Real, are just fantastic. The cold sound palette and the instrumentation is easily one of the best parts of the album for me. Sure, they may not be on the level of catchy and as just as catchy as, say, Disorder or the posthumous single Love Will Tear Us Apart, But they do such a fantastic job at conveying like the bleakness it's going for. And as I mentioned, it's so trance-inducing for me. So much so that it's like I'm on another plane of existence. Um, some of my favorite Joy Division songs appear on Closer. Uh, but obviously, this album is. I'm kind of brushing over, like just talking there for a second about instrumentation shit. Kind of brushing over just how challenging this album can be to listen to. Like there's definitely some caution to be made when you go listen to this thing. Just obviously, just knowing everything that surrounds it. And if it wasn't clear already, I adore Closer. It's one of my favorite albums of all time, and I would be kidding myself if I didn't put it at the number one spot on the list. It's just, yeah. I won't speak anymore. Just, of course, rest in peace, Ian Curtis.
Yeah, R.I.P. And I adore Unknown Pleasures, and I would be kidding myself if I didn't put it at the number one spot on my list. What can I say about this album that just hasn't been reiterated time and time again? It's just one of the most iconic, classic albums of all time, and that title is just perfectly warranted. The influence this album has is just still present in countless bands to this day. So many, incredible artists, claim that Joy Division were a massive influence in their work, and it's really easy to see. It all started, this entire, saga with Joy Division and New Order. It all started with a group of lads in Manchester, and the project that started it all is still, to me, the standout album in Joy Division and Unknown Pleasures and New Order's combined discography. My favorite band, man. This is the one album that Joy Division released while Ian Curtis was still alive, and obviously, despite not being as bleak and hopeless as Closer, it still kind of is engulfed in kind of a cold mist of hopelessness. It is a very dark album and easily one of the darkest albums of the 70s. But what really strikes me as special about this project is how it manages to seamlessly combine so many directions thematically and musically, and combine them into one cohesive unit. It's an incredible album, and to me it's well and truly perfect. The atmosphere of this album is just very, as I said, dark and brooding. The instrumentation, however, is incredibly tight, incredibly impactful, and surprisingly very catchy at times. And then, of course, Ian's vocals and songwriting are nothing short of spectacular. Tracks like New Dawn Fades, and there's just so many to count. Day of the Lords just sent shivers down my spine with how powerful Ian's performances are, and how impactful they have been proven to be, given what happened just a mere year later. This album, I think, just has it all in terms of Joy Division for me. It has everything I love about the band. It has honestly everything I love in music, and it just has standout after standout after standout. And honestly, just calling these tracks standouts just feels like an understatement to me, because tracks like Disorder, Insight, they're some of the best songs ever made, period. Disorder in particular, it is the opening track, but to this day, it's one of the best opening tracks of all time. It's one of the greatest pieces of music of all time. I think Insight is also a track I mentioned, and I have to reiterate just how incredible it is, because to me it's one of the most overlooked tracks of all time. Understandably, there's some incredible moments on this album, but I genuinely think that Insight is just a tiny notch behind Disorder as the best track in this album. Of course, there's tracks like She's Lost Control, which is just chaos and panic in its most organized form. Interzone just absolutely fucking kicks ass. New Dawn Fades, Candidate, and Day of the Lord are gut-wrenching. This album just doesn't have a single moment that isn't breathtaking, that isn't special, and it is one of my favorite albums of all time. It's one of the greatest, achievements in music history, and its influence is just matched by very, very few projects. So yeah, absolutely love this album, and it is my number one pick.
Alright. My favourite tracks from Closer are Atrocity Exhibition, Heart and Soul, and The Eternal. I have no least favourite tracks.
My favourite tracks on Unknown Pleasures are Disorder, Insight, and Shadowplay, and of course I do not have any least favourite tracks.
And with that in mind, we did it. That is the end of today's episode. That was very good.
Let's go, dude.
Alright. And to end the episode off, thank you guys so much for checking out today's episode where we ranked Joy Division New Order's discography. We really hope that you enjoyed. Of course, leave some of your favorites and least favorites down below. We'd like to see what you guys are saying. Obviously, in the description, there's going to be links to the Cassette Tapes Discord server, the Cassette Tapes Patreon, our own individual channels, as well as our Album of the Year and Rate Your Music pages. And yeah, with that in mind, my name's been MickyT.
I've been Nostalgia.
Gluck.
Well. Look, lads.
Go on,
see you on the
boys.
other side, man.
Go on, lads.
Go on.
Go on, the boys.
Go on then, it's over. You can leave. Go on.